I started a sermon series on elders, and we spent our time talking about what the office of elder is. The idea that in Israel, the elder is the wisdom leader, the guy who sits in the gates, and that you come and get your direction in life from. That you have a problem, a dispute or something, you would go to the city elders and ask for help. It's also kind of an oversight position that would help the city function well. So if there's problems in the cities, those problems will make their way to the city elders. And the city elders will know about those, and they'll get together to figure out a wise way to solve those problems. That's what that office was. This morning, I want us to look at, what are we supposed to look for this office? If someone is going to hold a position in the church, what kind of person ought that be? In order to do that, we follow the direction of Scripture. The Apostle Paul actually gives very clear advice to two guys whose job it was to appoint those elders. And it's an interesting thing that in the Scripture, when we look through the Bible, the elders are always appointed by one person. Either Paul appoints them, or Timothy appoints them, or Titus appoints them. In Timothy and Titus's cases, there's a reason for that. We get this guidance from Paul in how to set up elders, because in Timothy's case, the eldership is actually the problem that needs to be overcome in the church where Timothy is serving. So Paul can't write to the elders and say, appoint more elders. They'll appoint more problematic elders. So he writes to Timothy and says, okay, your job is to dilute that negative, awful group. You're also going to have to deal with them. You're going to have to stand up in the presence of everybody and rebuke an elder who persists in sin. He'll tell him to do that. My goodness, what an awful job that would be. Can you imagine me standing up here and calling out an elder by name? But that's what he told Timothy to do. It's because it's a broken eldership. And so he can't write to the eldership to say, okay, here's how you perpetuate the role that you're in, keep it going, because they're unhealthy. And they'll appoint unhealthy people. In Titus's case, there's no eldership to write to. Titus is alone on the island of Crete. And the island of Crete, according to the letter to Titus, is a place full of lazy bones and liars. It's a broken culture. They're wicked, evil people there. But there's been a church planted there. And Titus got left behind by Paul with the job of, okay, now that we've got converts, we've got disciples, set up the order of the church. Get it put in place, so get elders appointed. Titus apparently hadn't done it. And I don't know that I blame him. That's a hard job. How do I even do it? How is the church today supposed to do that? Because I tell you, it's an important role in the church, isn't it? Having godly leaders. Have you ever seen a church with problematic leaders? Well, I've been there. I'm so blessed to work where we are right now. We don't have trouble here. But I've been in places where I have faced trouble. This job is miserable when you have wicked elders, but so is just church membership. Because broken elders lead churches into all kinds of fights and conflicts and problems. They pull power plays. Have you ever seen the phenomenon where you have a really, really godly man right up until he has power? And the moment power's in his hands, he's not godly anymore. So he doesn't have to be. He's in control. How do you avoid a mess like that? How do you avoid have you ever seen this or heard of this in church? A lot of money passes through churches. We pay missionaries, we pay the preacher, but we also do a lot of care for the poor. So there's a lot of other people's money moving around. And when you're in a power position, it's easy for that money to end up in places where it shouldn't go. Have you ever heard of that happening in a church? How do you avoid that? How do you make sure that you don't end up with monsters leading the church? Broken people that shouldn't have been there. Well, as Timothy and Titus have been given this job, Timothy is in the city of Ephesus. And remember, in Ephesus, in Acts chapter 19, Paul told the elders, from among your own ranks will become wolves who won't spare the flock. Well, by the time Timothy is serving in Ephesus, that's happened. There's people that are going house to house to enrich themselves, and the leadership of the church is broken. People are not going to move toward Jesus under that kind of leadership. Their lives aren't going to grow and thrive. And remember, why are we doing all of this? Why do we get together and worship once a week? Why do we do it? Isn't it so that we can have our lives changed from one degree of glory to another? Isn't it for the sake of spiritual growth? Leaving behind the brokenness of this world and all of our sinfulness? And taking on the character and the nature of Jesus Christ? Becoming more and more like Him? Such that when we find ourselves, by His grace in the courts of heaven, we don't feel like we don't belong there. Now, this is all preparation for a much, much better existence. It's why we come, so that we can be transformed and changed from the evil of this world into the glory of the Son of God. Well, who's going to help us do that? Churches need to be led by people that are doing that, period. And when Paul writes to Timothy and when Paul writes to Titus, what he gives them is direction for what to look for. Look for people who are living their lives in pursuit of Jesus Christ. Period. And in fact, look for people who that pursuit has taken hold to such a degree that you can see it. You can see it. That's, if you boil down, you put 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1, you put them in a pot with some water, and you turn up the heat, and you boil it until the water is gone, and what you have is the crust on the bottom of the pot. That's the crust. That's the crux of it. Look for Christ in people's hearts. Because you want people who are capable of leading other people to be like Jesus. Period. That's the goal. Have you ever asked yourself why these qualities of a person are there? You know, I've seen so many discussions of this. I'm 50 years old, so I've lived in the Church of Christ my whole life. And these two texts are like super important to us about church leadership. But without asking that question, this becomes a checklist. You know, hospitable. Well, he had somebody over for coffee one time. He clears the bar. Apt to teach. You know, he's likely to start teaching at any minute. Apt to teach. Crosses the bar. You know, and it's just a checklist. And it reduces it from look at this person and see if they are like Christ to see if they clear a set of, can they jump through hoops? And I've seen that used by churches in the most ugly way. You know, every church has got in it a spectrum of maturity. People who are very much like Jesus and people who have a ways to go. Every church has got that. I've seen these lists used by the least mature Christians to try to eliminate some of the most mature and keep them from being led because they don't like them. That is not their purpose. These lists were given to these two men whose jobs it was to say, how do I find people? These are converts, all of them. And these are disciples of the Lord. They are learning the way of the Lord. How do I find the guys that are going to be able to lead this church to be like Jesus? And who will keep the focus there? You know, it's so easy for mission creep to come along where we forget that our purpose in coming together is not to sing the songs I like. The purpose for coming together is to be like Christ. to find the way out of selfishness and into love and mercy. Who's going to do that? These two lists are given to these men to say, okay, when you go and you interview these guys, this is what you look for. There are basically three things on this list: the guy's family life, the guy's character, and the guy's capacity to handle the story. Is he able to help people disciple? Those three things are what's on that list. Okay? So the first one, the first one in both lists is he's got to be above reproach, which means that he's not open to obvious criticism. And I think that one actually governs the whole list. That this is a person who is actually like Christ, an honorable person. The second one on both lists, by the way, the lists are different. You could appoint godly elders from either one of these lists. You don't have to combine them into some list that neither one of these guys had. That would actually be a mistake. Neither Timothy nor Titus had the list that is the superimposed lists over each other, which means that either one of them works just fine. Okay? The second one is a look into the man's family. Both of them say husband of one wife, or really the Greek says man of one woman. One woman man. That's because the Greek word gynike means woman, but it also means wife. They don't have a separate word for wife. And the Greek word aner means man, but it also means husband. They've got a couple of words for man. They have aner and they have anthropos, but that word aner, it can just mean man, right? I think what he's looking for is not a checkbox to say, well, are there two? Well, then he's done. A lot of people have had a mess in their life, come to Christ, and the mess cleans up. And it sometimes gets cleaned up right here. The point is faithfulness in marriage. You're meant to look at the way the man lives in his married life, and what's he look like? How does he treat his wife? And does he treat her in such a way that they've stayed married? Has he thrown her away? Is he the kind of man that throws women away? Has he driven her away? Is he the kind of the man who beats her up? What kind of man is he in his marriage? Look at this man's heart and look for Jesus. What are you talking about? Jesus was never married. Okay, correct. But how would Jesus function had he been married? Well, he would have been faithful to her. In fact, Jesus is married. To whom? The church. We are the bride of Christ. How does he treat us? Look for that in the married life of the man. Look for the gentle love of his wife that helps her to grow and thrive and honors her in public and is kind to her and good to her. Look for that committed married man, that one-woman man who isn't distracted by other ladies, but is committed just to this one and cherishes her and loves her and wants to see her thrive and grow. It's not a checkbox thing. It's a look at his character. The same is true of his kids. In both lists, we bring up the kids. So he must manage his own household well. In 1 Timothy 3, verse 4. He must manage his own household well with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for the church of God? Or in 1 Timothy 1, verse 6, if anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife, and his children are believers, and not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. And what is that about? We're talking about using the window into the man's heart that's shown by the window into his family. How does he behave when he's in his family? Does he drive his kids nuts? And I don't mean the playful, he said, come pull my finger. And I don't mean that. I mean, does he make his kids hate him? Does he move his children to frustration? Or does he neglect his kids such that they can never get his attention? They never pay attention to him, and so they've wandered from him and his ways. Looking for a man who has children who are faithful is not about his mind control over them. It's about his influence in their life. As he led them to grow up into the Lord. Have they become believers? And I don't know that we're looking for perfection there. You can't expect an elder to be a better dad than God. And remember, Adam is son of God, according to Luke. And Adam didn't grow up well, right? But God was a good father. You're looking for the kind of father that he is, for the way he relates to his children, because you can expect that same sort of relation to show up in the way that he relates to the church. Is he able to disciple people? Is he able to lead people to faith? Because if he can't do it at home, he won't do it here. So what do you see? Do you see people growing under his leadership? Are they thriving under it? Do you see how it's a window into his heart? The reason that he needs to have faithful children isn't because, well, check that box. It's what kind of man is this? Who are you dealing with? Then he shifts, I'm mostly following Timothy, but then he shifts into, okay, look for these attributes of the heart. And as I'm going to read through this list, and as I read this, ask yourself, whom is he describing? Who's he talking about? What kind of person is this? And I don't mean the elder, I mean who else? Who is he saying the elder ought to look like? Okay? So, 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2. He's got to be above reproach, husband of one wife. He needs to be sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, and able to teach. Those are all positive attributes. Then he says some things that he ought not be. He ought not be a drunkard, violent but gentle, quarrelsome, and not a lover of money. Who is that? Who does that describe? Brothers and sisters, that is your Lord. He is describing people who are living like Jesus, shaped into the image of Jesus. Because this is what Jesus is like. The first word I have here is sober-minded, and in the Greek, the word is like temperate, meaning in control of one's passions. That the hungers are not out of control. So you're not driven by, the three big masteries of mankind: sex, food, and drink. Things that destroy us, that undo us. No, that person is in control of those hungers. How did he get to be in control? Because he looked at Jesus, who was in control of his. Do you see him acting out? He's sober-minded. He has self-control, which is fruit of the Spirit, right? This is a person who is not likely to fly off the handle, but is actually they may have tempers, but those tempers are not flying out. They have control of it. They're growing in that self-control. They're respectable, meaning that people respect them. You certainly don't want to put someone into leadership that everyone looks at and goes, what's wrong with that guy? All right, they're respectable and they are hospitable. One of the first pictures that a person is truly converted in the book of Acts is they invite people into their home and they eat with them. Look through the book of Acts and see how many times that happens. They're following the Lord who welcomes everyone into their lives. Everyone is welcome to be in the life of Jesus Christ. He honors and welcomes everyone. Look for someone who's like that. He talks about able to teach. And here the picture, we so often convert this into the modern church, and able to teach means able to lead a Bible class. And so if you're introverted, you're kind of off the list, right? If you can't stand in front of a large group of people, this must not be for you. No, I think the window is that this is a person that cares that other people come to know God. The teaching that goes on might be in a very small group. It might even be something where they sit in the city gates and people come to them. and want advice. But this is going to be somebody who, Jesus was a teacher. He did not sit back and say, good luck with life. I know all the answers, but I'm busy living my life. So this is going to be somebody who's able to engage, able to care about people and sit down with them and say, okay, I know you have this problem. How is God at work in it? And they lead people to the way of God. And they may teach and they may preach or teach in a large assembly as well. But the goal here is that this is a person that people respect enough to listen to, and who knows the gospel and knows God and knows Jesus well enough to share it with other people. Those are all positive attributes. And then he looks at some things to say, not this guy, right? So not a drunkard. Why not? Well, because why do people become drunkards? And the thing that drives people into the life of addiction and brokenness that's found there is unprocessed pain and trouble. A person who's living there, they haven't really all the way released into God's control their broken life. It's not the drunkenness, that's wicked. This is a window into your heart. What is this person like inside? Have they released trouble into God's hands? The same thing is true of violence. Although this violence, I suspect, and this one is so important, that in a negative list, he gives its opposite to make sure you got it. Not violent, but gentle. Right? This is hugely important. The violence may be physical that he's worried about. If it's a guy who goes and punches people in the nose, probably not at your top of your list for elder, right? But it can also be kind of an emotional violence. A person who lashes out. A person who easily loses their temper and gets grouchy and grumpy and mean. That's not like Christ. That's not like him. So this person, you shouldn't appoint this person, right? Or not quarrelsome. There are folks in every religious community who really get excited about fighting about God. They'll have lots of arguments about God. If you let them, they'll do it. Right? If you run into that kind of person, don't be that kind of person. But don't put that kind of person in the leadership. If their big deal is being right all the time about everything, how will they deal with the people that are broken? How will they help? If they have to win every fight and argument, and if they make everything into an argument, are they following the Christ? Or how successfully are they? And this is definitely a place of brokenness. Not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. Why? Because it's dangerous. There's going to be money passing through the church. And it's so easy to say, well, just this little bit won't hurt anything. No one will notice that I did this and took my wife out to dinner with church money. No one will notice that. It's not big enough to notice. And it's so easy for that to become $100,000 that disappeared out of the church's funds that could have fed the poor. Don't put someone who has a problem with greed into a position where they can have access over the money. But you take all of those together, and what are they? They're a window into the heart. And as Timothy sits down with somebody that he's considering for eldership, and first of all, he will have observed that person enough to know that this is a person I should sit down with and talk to. And then as he's going to ask him questions, he's going to be looking into the man's heart. Is this a person whose life bears the marks of following Jesus? And if he is, these beautiful things are going to be there in him. And if he's not, these horrible things are going to still be a problem for him. And obviously, this is not you better be perfect in all of these. Good grief. Jesus would be the only leader of our churches. I hope that he is leading our churches, but we're looking at this, looking into the heart, looking for a trajectory of life. What is it that characterizes this person's heart? And if it's these things of goodness, then you know that that's a person who is faithful to Jesus and can share that with others. And if it's broken stuff, maybe they're not ready yet. Maybe they need to keep cooking with the Lord. The last thing that he throws at them are issues of, okay, are they ready and prepared to handle gospel stuff? Are they capable of that? Have they marinated long enough in the faith that they're able to share the faith with other people? So he says he must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Is he a person who says, if a person says to you, I don't think I'm ready for this job, they're probably right. Now, they may not be. We pump up false humility in churches all the time. And it may be that they're being called and saying no to the call, right? I don't want to do that. It'll hurt. It'll be hard. Churches can be mean. I don't want to do it. But it may be that they absolutely are correct. They have some work and study to do. So if someone hasn't been a Christian for very long, or, and this is harder, but if they've been a Christian for a long time, but they haven't progressed much, right? Have you ever heard of the guy who's been a Christian for 50 years versus the guy who's been a Christian for 1 year 50 times? You know, the meanness still has hold and the brokenness is all in there. You know, I don't know that he's just looking at, well, how many weeks has it been since they were baptized? He's looking for not a recent convert in sort of outlook in life. What's important to them? And the reason is because of that characteristic I talked to you about at the beginning of the sermon, where I talked about, have you ever seen somebody who's this good, godly person until they get power and then they're mean? That's what he's talking about. You know, this leadership position, it puts a lot of stresses on people and it opens up a lot of opportunities to do a lot of harm. So don't put someone there fast. You know, test them in the faith. You know, they need to have been growing, not a recent convert. And then he says, moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders. Well, why is that? Do you want to be a disciple-making church? Do you want to be a church that reaches out into the world? Because if you've got somebody that everybody knows is a jerk, including you, you know, and they're leading your church, how successful are you going to be at that? Right? You need to be somebody that is able to relate to people with love. Kind of like Jesus did. I think Jesus, you know, shows us how this bar ought to be cleared, if you will. Because Jesus didn't make everybody like him. There are a lot of people that didn't care very much for Jesus. You know, but what they couldn't do is accuse him of wanton evil, right? And if he's not well thought of by outsiders, he may fall into disgrace and the snare of the devil. And then he's got to be able to hold on to the trustworthy word. He's got to be able to carry this forward. You see, there are three big criterion that are here. Look at the family, but you look at the family because the family reveals the heart. Look at the character, because that reveals what's going on in the heart. And look at how they manage the word that's been entrusted to them, because that reveals that faithful heart. What are we to look for? We're to look at the heart. And what are we to look for in the heart? Jesus. Look for someone who is a disciple of Jesus, who has received training by the Lord, who is mastered by him and wants to be, who is living a life that reveals a faithful heart. We corrupt this when we reduce it to some sort of checklist where you check boxes if it's all right. Now, one final word as we wrap up. These lists were given to individuals. I kind of mentioned this earlier in the sermon, but I want to hit it again. These lists were not given to a group of people to go out and appoint elders. It was certainly not given to the church. These lists were given to a guy named Timothy and to a guy named Titus. And that tells us something about how they were used. You know, that it was so easy to use these things abusively and keep people from being leaders. I cannot tell you how many times in my life, and I've been doing this now almost 27 years, 26 years, something like that. And in my life, I have talked with people who are like, no, I will not be an elder because I will not survive the gauntlet. And I'm like, what do you mean? You have the mark of Christ all over you. Christians are mean. That's what they mean. Don't be a jerk. Don't do that in this process. Don't do that. Now, if you have godly concern, good, raise it, lift it, but you have to do it in a godly way. You can't snipe from the back row. You can't hide in the shadows. You can't attack anonymously, and you can't be mean when you do it. If you have concern about somebody and you're like, I'm not sure that this person is someone that God wants in leadership, go to the elders, talk to them by all means. Maybe talk to that person. It might be they're able to alleviate your concerns. But if you can't do those two things, don't be a coward and snipe at them. Don't do it. Because you're called to be a Christian too. And guess what? This list, it applies to every single one of us. There's nobody that gets to look at that list and say, well, that's for our leaders, but it's not for me. And if you are violent in heart, guess what needs to happen to you? I don't know that warning is needed here, but I say it just in case. Let's be Christian in the appointment of Christian leaders. Let's be godly in the means in which we carry this out. Let's avoid things like quarrelsomeness and violence, but gentleness. Let's all be beautiful as we do this together, because this tends to be a place where the hardest parts of Adam's leftovers in us show up. And we don't want that, do we? Be gracious as we seek gracious leaders. Can we do that? Let's be Christians. Let's be good and beautiful in the pursuit of godly Christian leaders. In this series of sermons on elders, I don't hit as hard on our personal brokennesses, and it may be that, maybe you've been convicted by something I've said today, but it may be that nothing I've talked about has really touched on the pain in your heart, but that pain is there. If it is, you don't have to walk out of here in dark. You can come into the light and the love of God. I don't think she would mind me saying this. Your prayers have meant the world, like the universe, to Nikki Grasso. She has had a transformation in her life, and she credits it to you. They're not here today because COVID hit their home, but they love you so much for what you've done for them and what God has done in her life. Praise God. If you need that same sort of thing, let us know. We'll pray for you. And if you haven't started following Jesus yet, today's the day to start. There's water right here. You can come. If this morning you're subject to the invitation of God, why don't you come right now while we stand and sing?